I feel tremendous guilt. Um, I think we all knew in the back of our minds, even though we feigned this whole line of like, there probably aren't any really bad unintended consequences. I think in the back, deep recesses of our minds, we kind of knew something bad could happen. But I think the way we defined it was not like this. It literally is a point now where I think we have created tools that are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works. That is truly where we are. And I would encourage all of you, as the future leaders of the world, to really internalize how important this is. If you feed the beast, that beast will destroy you. If you push back on it, we have a chance to control it and rein it in. And it is a point in time where people need to hard break from some of these tools and the things that you rely on. The short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. No civil discourse, no cooperation, misinformation, mistruth. And it's not an American problem. This is not about Russian ads. This is a global problem.
As a member of the generation that's been most directly affected by social media, I want to take a deeper look on how social media has affected society. I've talked to journalists, I've talked to teachers, and I've talked to psychologists asking these questions. The first topic I wanted to look at is how addiction has shaped people's behaviors over the last 10 to 20 years.
I think it depends on how you think about that. Like, effect on relationships, like, so if you're on your cell phone to the exclusion of tending to your relationships, yes, that is comparable to drug addiction or alcoholism. But what the alcohol and drugs actually do to your body, is different. Then you're talking about a physiological dependency on something as opposed to a psychological one. Like, addiction and compulsion are sort of related, but they're not the same thing. And so, like, a compulsion is a behavior, and the addiction is, the way that I think about it, is a more physiological response to something, to a chemical, not a neurotransmitter, which is what dopamine is. So I think about that more as a compulsion, like this need to do it behaviorally, not need to do it because you're having symptoms of a withdrawal. But I think in some ways, functionally, like in terms of like how much or to what extent it keeps you from your relationships, or it keeps you from your work or your schoolwork or whatever, that if it's affecting your normal functioning, then it functionally it is acting like an addiction, I think.
So, for example, like if it's pouring rain out in Midtown and you see people smoking cigarettes out front, that's addiction, period. Like, that's what you're witnessing. And so when people are changing their behaviors to such an extent that it's clearly interrupting with their life, that generally is the thing that people start to talk about in terms of addiction. And social media, absolutely, no doubt, has that component to it, without question.
I think face-to-face conversation is valuable. I think as kids learning to read the interpersonal cues, body language, facial expressions, tone, I think all of that stuff is really important. And I think there's a lot of information in all of that. And it's much more interesting, I think. And I think a lot of misunderstandings happen, texts and emails and stuff, because you can't hear the tone. You just sort of see the words and then you project, you fill in the tone based on your own experiences, you know what I mean? It could be perfectly neutral text, but you've just been yelled at by someone, and so you're feeling bad about yourself, and so you hear it in a critical way, and it may not have been.
Again, it comes back to socialization skills. If they're only connected through people with their cell phone, and they're not having interaction. It's just like almost like homeschooling. You have to have your peers involved when you have socialization, and that's part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't have that and you don't have love and belonging, socialization, physical maturity, there's a big problem. And I think that the psychologists, it's still relatively new because cell phones started like 1995. So right now they're 24 years old. The kids that were born then are addicted. Now the new kids are coming up the line, and I have preschoolers that have little cell phones.
Like anything in moderation, I think is okay, generally speaking. But I think that if the cell phone or the iPad or whatever becomes a substitute for interactions, or even being bored, to be honest with you. Like I think that there was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about we need to let our kids be bored again. And I totally agree with that sentiment. So like it affects like their relationships, I think, because they're not sort of kind of forced to interact. They can just focus on the screen. But I think more broadly, it affects their imagination. You know what I mean? Their ability to find something to do or to be bored and then have to deal with that. You know, it's like constant stimulation. I don't think it's a great thing. You know what I mean? I think it excludes things like thinking creatively or using your imagination or even problem solving. Like, I don't like what I'm doing right now. Let me figure something else out.
I think that attention span is without question impacted by the nature of social media, that it's so instantaneous, it's quick. And I think as a society, we're starting to see on a massive level disengagement with more complex pieces of art in particular, which really makes me sad, and how artists intend for you to want to view something and consume the media.
Yeah.
I think that is particularly true if you're a musician. You know, it's harder and harder for people to put out records that are an hour and 20 minutes.
Or that people even care about.
Oh, exactly.
Like,
yeah.
you know,
to listen to a record. It's like people don't.
Dude, like, yeah, completely. I'm completely there. I saw an advertisement for a car like a year ago that had this smiley emoji with the hearts in the eyes as the only description of the car. And that was done deliberately because their media, I mean, their marketing knows that we're coming to a point where people don't want to read anymore, and their attention spans are profoundly low.
I think it's clear that if you look at a case like Charlottesville, which I know a little bit about because of having worked on the Vice project, the people that showed up for that event, many of them were in their basements, in their living rooms, etc., who were all part of an online community and were informing one another almost like a loop. And they were getting each other very excited about this, this rally. And it was clear that rally there were going to be a fair number of really unsavory people showing up with, I would consider, by most standards, like repugnant, racist, anti-Semitic views. And yet they were empowered by that. I think what's interesting is if you look at the next year that Charlottesville was being organized, I don't know the exact number, but it was under 24 people showed up. Oh. So on the one hand, it burned, and it's always with the new media, whether it's television when it came out or radio, and now the web. With radio, I'm throwing this together like I know I'm making this up as I speak, but you have War of the Worlds where you inflame a whole community with this thing that's obviously fake, but there were enough people who were, I guess in a way, credulous enough to believe what was happening was real because of the medium that it was being delivered in. Same thing with television, and same thing with online media. It's the new powerful medium. And so, anyway, all this is to say back to Charlottesville, you have people coming together, like, do they exist in part because of the ability with this kind of social media? Without question. Like, that's how they met. That's how they all got together.
Now, it's not all bad. There's many elements of social media that have had a profound effect on society.
If there's like a major event and you need to know, like, is there power? Is there gasoline? Like, is the water contaminated? Like, in situations like that, I think people are really happy that these kinds of this kind of approach and these devices and these apps exist because they're very helpful.
So I think it comes down to how you use it, because you could be an advocate for social change in social media and be a kid. You know, I teach Marley Diaz, who is a profound advocate for social change and for social justice through that, and she and like her or many different influencers are, you know, profoundly important, and youths can use those platforms to express themselves. Are the majority doing that? No, they're using it for dopamine. They're using it for some kind of, you know,
Because that's what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, but it becomes addicting and it becomes emotionally fulfilling.
I think they've been overwhelmingly positive. You're looking at like a broad societal view. I mean, look, you have abilities to know information that, you know, was not available. It's changing the way that we think, and I think that's all, you know, overwhelmingly positive. It's, you know, knowing things is good.
But two things come to mind with social media. One, obviously, the speed at which people get news without filters is a totally different thing, and that's empowered virtually anyone that wants to be a journalist to be a journalist in a sense, because you don't need a license to practice journalism, and that's something that you hear in journalism school quite a bit, and it should be that way. So I think that's been good for a sort of overall democratizing of how people get news. I think the other side, which is a little more, it's a little less clear whether this is a good thing, is that because the barriers of entry are lower, the quality of the information is often not vetted on the same level that it would have been for a company that's making money, trying to do work that's good and doesn't want to get sued because they get their reporting wrong, or, you know, like any kind of business, if you don't do a good job enough times, eventually your business will suffer because of it. So that sort of reinforcement for quality has been eliminated, and I think that that's not always a good thing for people. But, you know, I recognize that the world changes. This is what it is, and in a lot of ways, like the microphone changed entertainment in silent film to talking film, streaming and social media, etc., has changed the industry in such a way that, like the microphone, it's this thing that will simultaneously change things but also eliminate a lot of jobs.
I mean, I teach politics, but with the downsides of that
Absolutely.
is you have, you know, you also, I talk about this all the time in classes, that you know, not everyone who writes anything on the internet is an expert in their field, and, you know, anybody who publishes something and tweets something, it doesn't make them correct, and, you know, teaching credibility of sources and who's saying something has been a downside of that. But overall, I think it's, you know, technological advancement, particularly in terms of communication, I think has been a positive on society.
And I think one thing we didn't touch upon is that it's created digital voyeurism to a T. Like,
Oh, yeah.
we can access any human
Very
being
true.
that we are interested in,
Yes.
with friends or whatever, complete strangers,
Yeah.
and peer into whatever life they're curating
Yes.
digitally. And that
that's
is...
weird.
And also, the thing is, Facebook, and not Facebook, well, yeah, I guess Facebook too, but Snapchat and Instagram stories know what they're doing because they allow you to see who looks at your profile. So that also creates a context. All of these things are creating context for making you attached to this technology.
And Facebook made things way more public. You had a public image.
Right.
And I think the difference when we were growing up was that we
didn't
were
have any of that.
None of us were cognizant of an online presence. Kids today are constantly on. They're
Always.
Snapchat is on, so therefore they're being recorded, or they're cognizant of how they look. As if when I was a kid, you know, like no, I never.
You never.
There was no concept. No one was
No.
taking a photo of you.
I think we'll see this as a period of time, I think, when people were really fully invested in getting information in a certain way at a pace and regularity that can't be sustained.
Yeah.
That's my guess. And I think something like podcasts are an indication where all of a sudden people seem to be willing to listen to an hour and a half of somebody talking if it's interesting, which is the, you know, complete opposite of what we're talking about. So, you know, these pendulums swing back and forth, and you know, in the end, I like to think that the right kind of equilibrium is established. But when the technology is new, people gobble it up, and being an American, whatever it is in America, if it's drugs or food or sex or whatever, we do more of it than everybody. And it's the same thing applies to
consume.
it's just, yeah. So that's my thinking about that, if that's helpful.
Society's always changing, and it's changed faster in the last 100 years than it's ever changed before. And the point of this documentary is not to demonize social media. It's not to make it more than what it is. I'm asking the question, is social media the next stage in human communication? Or is it the downfall of society? I'm going to leave that to the viewer. Thank you.